The final mechanism of hypertrophy we're going to discuss is muscle damage. Exercise-induced muscle damage is referring to the damage that occurs to muscles caused by resistance training. This damage can be isolated to just a few macromolecules of tissue or expressed through large tears in the connective tissue and or the actual muscle contractile elements. The typical symptoms of exercise-induced muscle damage include a decrease in force production, an increase in muscle stiffness and swelling, a delayed onset muscle soreness, regularly referred to as DOMS, as well as an increased physiological stress response like elevated heart rate, extra lactate production, and an increase in inflammatory markers. Exercise-induced muscle damage primarily works by an increase in an inflammatory response, which then stimulates satellite cells to become more active. When a muscle is injured, satellite cells are then signaled and activated. These satellite cells then proliferate, which simply means to rapidly reproduce and increase in numbers. And they do this following muscle trauma with the intent of repairing or creating new muscle fibers. Image A on the left shows a regular muscle, while image B on the right shows a damaged muscle. And you can see the variance in the damage in the striations of the muscle. Now, the severity of the exercise-induced muscle damage has a direct effect on whether or not hypertrophy will occur. And the level of damage depends on several factors. These factors are the type of muscle contraction, the intensity, and the total volume of training. First, we're going to comb over contraction types. Concentric, isometric, and eccentric contractions can all elicit exercise-induced muscle damage. However, eccentric contractions have a much greater impact on total muscle damage. See, eccentric contractions produce the greatest anabolic response, and therefore research often focuses on this type of action. And this is because eccentric strength is approximately 20 to 50% greater than concentric strength, which allows for heavier loads during exercise. Also, the forces generated during eccentric training are about 45% higher than those generated during concentric training, and are also roughly double that of isometric training. And these greater forces and load capacities produce much greater mechanical tension per active fiber. And this is believed to occur because of a reversal of the size principle of recruitment. Recall when we discussed motor units and the hierarchy of muscle fiber recruitment, where fibers are recruited in order of smallest type 1 fibers to biggest type 2 fibers. Well, the reversal of this would be that type 2 fibers are recruited preferentially over type 1 fibers. So for example, there is evidence showing preferential fast twitch recruitment occurs as de-recruitment of slow twitch fibers occurs during the eccentric phase of both plantar flexion and knee flexion. This recruitment reversal appears to result in different signaling responses in regards to protein synthesis, and therefore produces different forms of adaptation. So basically, since concentric and eccentric muscle actions appear to recruit muscle fibers in different orders, both concentric and eccentric actions should be incorporated in resistance training. The next piece is that intensity of the exercises influences the amount of cumulative damage. High tension through a muscle fiber due to excessive load results in structural damage of the muscle cell. So as the intensity increases, so does the potential damage. And finally, we factor in volume. Exercise-induced muscle damage is dose responsive. Therefore, workouts performed with a greater training volume elicit a greater degree of muscle damage. So as the volume increases, so does the amount of damage. And this part is so important, but we're going to come back to it in a moment, so just hang in there for a few seconds. Inflammation, brought about by exercise-induced muscle damage, creates this cascade of physiological signals. And it's this inflammatory response from the muscle damage that provokes a hypertrophic response in the body and allows for muscle growth. However, this hypertrophic response from exercise-induced muscle damage via the inflammation is dose dependent. This means that too little or too much inflammation can yield no hypertrophy, which brings us back to the topic of volume. One of the biggest mistakes that trainees make is having too little or way too much volume. The goal is to have just enough damage to create the appropriate amount of inflammation without overdoing it. See, too much muscle damage incurred during training that exceeds the body's capabilities to recover and repair will ultimately mitigate any potential hypertrophy. And this is because the ability to train at the appropriate intensities and frequencies will be impaired for extended periods of time. This graph shows how as muscle damage increases, so does the time needed between sessions. It's important to also note that too little muscle damage simply does not have or create enough of an inflammatory response and won't create a hypertrophic response. So using muscle damage as a mechanism of hypertrophy is not recommended for novice trainees. And this is because the hypertrophy response seen from exercise-induced muscle damage heavily depends on recovery capacity. Novice trainees simply don't have the ability to repair and recover quick enough between bouts of training. So the goal isn't to slam them into the ground, because if you do, it'll be too long before they're able to hit the gym again. Therefore, muscle damage as a mechanism for hypertrophy is recommended for well-trained individuals with a sound recovery capacity. Considering the hypertrophic response from muscle damage is dose dependent, a protocol that elicits just a moderate amount of muscle damage is the ideal.